Good evening from Voice of America headquarters in Washington, D.C. My name is Miroslava Ґонґадзе. I'm Eastern Europe chief for Voice of America. A year ago, Russia invaded Ukraine in a major escalation of the Russian-Ukrainian war, which began in 2014 from occupation of Crimea. Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol, Izium are Ukrainian cities now widely known for Russia's war crimes against the civilian population. As of now, over 9,000 innocent people have been murdered by Russian forces, some just for speaking Ukrainian or wearing Ukrainian symbols. The war has created Europe's largest refugee crisis since World War II. Today, we are with our guest audience and expert panelists. We will examine the war and the response of the world, and will try to look ahead. We welcome our audience participation online on VOA YouTube and Facebook pages. My colleagues from the anchor desk of Russian service, Рафаэль Сааков, will be on the lookout for the questions and reflections from the studio and online. Since the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, VOA has been on the front line, telling the world about this unjust war, as it did 80 years ago during World War II, when VOA started its operation to counter Nazis' propaganda. VOA today is much different than it was 80 years ago. However, its mission stays the same: to be a credible, factual, and unbiased source of news. Simply, to tell the truth. In the first part of our discussion, we will have with us today Yolanda Lopes, acting VOA director, and director of digital strategy, Metью Beyz. Welcome. Thank you. Thank you for being with us today. So, Yolanda, why today VOA mission and work is as relevant and as important as it was 80 years ago?
Well, it is today. I think that either today or around this week is the 81st anniversary of Voice of America, and it was created because as a way to counter Nazi propaganda. Right now, we continue, as you said before, with the same mission, but we are countering misinformation and disinformation. But the information and the misinformation that we are countering is around the world. So what it has changed is the reach in which we are trying to get our news and information and our comprehensive way of providing the news to our audience, but around the world. But the mission continues to be the same. It has changed also the means, and Matthew will tell you more about the technology and the way we are trying to reach our audience wherever they are. We try, and we have been doing this for 81 years, trying to find that audience and try to meet with them and to focus on them, what is it that they need, and providing them with the news and information that they need to get their opinions and to make informed decisions.
Metью, VOA has changed over the years. Television, spread of social media, internet, but VOA audience is growing year after year. What makes VOA relevant today?
Well, you talk about how we've been around for over 80 years now. One of the most important things for us is adapting to where our audiences are and the platforms that they use. I think it's widely known that VOA started as a radio organization. It wasn't by accident. Shortwave was an incredibly effective way to reach people around the world. In the early days of VOA, we still do have a pretty robust radio operation here, but in the last 10 years or so, most of our audience comes from television and from digital platforms. Digital is the fastest growing, but both of those segments of the audience have surpassed radio, and recently we hit our highest measured number in our history. We now reach 326 million adults weekly around the world because of that ability to adapt to changing platforms and media.
today I'm hearing that our audience are tuned to VOA a lot, and specifically because of Ukraine, VOA is covering the war very intensively in Ukraine. How does audience behavior change? How do you see an audience behavior and interest to watch and listen to VOA?
I think one of the most unique things about this story is that typically, because VOA covers so many countries in so many languages, typically most people care about their own countries. Americans care about news in the United States. Turks care about Turkey. People in Venezuela care about Venezuela. And rarely do those tend to spill over. I think you don't see a lot of our audiences paying attention to news out of Ukraine and Russia until this story erupted last year. And when that happened, it is one of only 2 stories I've ever seen in over a decade at VOA where there was intense interest across almost every single one of our languages in this story. The only other story that got this kind of attention consistently was in 2020, was the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic and the early months of that. And so what we saw is countries that typically don't pay a lot of attention to news out of Russia or Ukraine or the region in general, like China, like Iran, a handful of sub-Saharan African countries, Latin American countries, all became intensely interested in this story. After the invasion, and day in and day out, we saw it in the analytics where there was just a lot of interest from all of our audiences. And the upshot of that was that we saw things like just to coverage of the invasion. We had over 80 million visits across our sites just between the beginning of the invasion and last fall. We had over 120 million engagement actions in social media, and in video views on social platforms, we had over 2 billion video views across all of our social accounts just to coverage of the invasion.
It's very important to say that VOA is covering this in 48 languages, and VOA is speaking to the audience in every country. Yolanda, VOA actually met the challenge. We sent a correspondent on the ground right away. But I want to ask you just more general question about the future. How do you see the future of VOA, and specifically in the region that are, in war today?
Yeah. Well, the future is continue what we are doing. Obviously, like you said, we have this rich 48 languages, right, all around the world. I think that it's important to focus on what we know how to do best, is to tell the story to the region, to tell to the region, to the people that live in Ukraine and Russia and neighboring countries, what is it that the world is thinking about, what is going on there, what is it that America is thinking, or what are the policies of America towards the world. But most importantly, I think that our strength is in the way we can cover locally the story and make it global. Mm-hmm. Because I think it is important to understand that this is not something that is happening to Ukraine or Russia. This is a global story that has a global impact. And that is why, and our audience is telling us that is why we have those numbers, because our audience recognize that all around the world, they are very interested in what is going on. And that is what Voice of America can continue providing and growing on telling that story to the rest of the world.
Thank you so much, and thank you, and keep up a good work. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
VOA always have been where the audience is. Today, the eyes of the whole world are on Ukraine, and my colleagues and I have been on the ground from the day one.
We're a couple hundred miles outside of Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, and we're driving through an area that was clearly an active battle zone very shortly before we got here, and we understand that Russian forces are right behind us, not specifically chasing us, but heading towards Kyiv. It's Friday evening, and the streets are almost empty here in central Kyiv, but we can hear bombs in the distance. This is the second day of what has become known as the invasion of Ukraine.
Це Шегині, 30 кілометрів до пункту перетину кордону. Тут автівку зупиняють і далі у вас 2 варіанти. Або рухаєтесь в черзі, або кидаєте машину і йдете пішки.
Ukraine's western city of Lviv has become a major hub for Ukrainians fleeing Russia's mortars and missiles. Anna recorded these brief videos.
They just on these stairs and they are begging, please, we wanted to leave Kyiv because we don't know what to do.
It took them 2 days to reach the Polish border.
What is impacted is everyday life for almost everyone in this country at this time, where there is fear in every corner that there may be fresh attacks, fresh violence, and the scale of the destruction could be so great. Some people say it could be the greatest conflict since World War II.
Зараз ми ірпенських, які приїхали сюди сьогодні. Давайте другу коляску.
A surreal soundtrack greets the sea of humanity fleeing Ukraine, a pianist with a message of peace. A momentary distraction from the misery unleashed by Russia's invasion.
It is remarkable how efficiently Poland has managed to absorb the huge number of refugees arriving over its borders so far. The question is how long that can continue as tens of thousands of refugees continue to arrive every day.
This is Bucha in Ukraine. You may have heard over the weekend, Ukrainian forces took this town and all the towns surrounding Kyiv. But as you can see, the violence here was considerable. And authorities say hundreds of civilians were found dead. Many of the bodies were found on the street.
Мы спали, потом папа, мама умерла. А что мне оставалось делать? Да, сын умерла. Я говорю, она с нами, она все видит, она нас охраняет.
Може мені просто не водить.
Since Putin launched his all-out invasion of Ukraine in February, the Russians' Black Sea-based fleet was at the center of the action. Ukrainian Navy forces prevailed.
Думали, что нам смогут где-то там дозвониться. И они спустились и пошли по морю, и папа шел сзади мамы. Тут взрыв.
До глубины души, до слез трогает, когда приходит пожилой человек, какая-нибудь пожилая женщина, и явно она не небольшого достатка, она не богатая, она приносит пакет с морковкой, яблоками и говорит, я купила, но я знаю, что вам это нужно.
Это обстрелы, приезжать на обстрелы, понимать, что именно произошло на этих обстрелах.
More than 400 bodies with sign of torture were found in this mass graveyard in Izum, Kharkiv region. As Russian troops retreated last week in the face of Ukrainian counteroffensive, they left behind chilling signs of horror Ukrainians suffered.
Слава Україні! Героям слава!
It is difficult to find a home still standing. This area of the city was the hardest hit by Russian shelling since the invasion began on February 24th.
It is just a matter of time when they will strike against your other allies. If we do not stop them now, we must do it.
Russian attacks on Ukraine's infrastructure began in October with massive strikes across the country, killing civilians and knocking out power structures. Since then, the devastation has continued. And as night falls in the capital, some entire neighborhoods are in the dark. But residents say life goes on as normally as possible, with or without the light.
You're watching the VOA special edition devoted to the Russian war in Ukraine. From VOA headquarters in Washington, D.C., with our guest audience and expert panelists, we are examining the war and the world response. We welcome our audience online on VOA's YouTube and Facebook pages. My colleague from VOA Russian service, Рафаэль Сааков, is on the lookout for questions and reflections from the studio guest and online audience. In the second part of the discussion, we will take an in-depth look at the international response to the war and its coverage by the media. So please welcome. Джордж Баррос is an analyst for the Institute for the Study of War, where he leads the Geospatial Intelligence team. Melínda Geríng is a director of stakeholder relations and social impact at the Superhuman Center and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. And VOA's own Ruslán Pетричка, the chief of Ukrainian service. Welcome. Pleasure to have you today. Melínda, you lived in Ukraine and you work hard in basically propelled Atlantic Council, become one of the main institutions in DC focused on Ukraine. How was it for you watching Ukraine big-scale invasion?
Miroslava, it's great to be here. It was devastating. You know, I think a lot of us have a personal stake in Ukraine and have friends there. But I think, to me, looking back a year, it's unbelievable to think about how much the world has changed in 365 days. The analytical community, of which I'm a part, got a lot wrong. In particular, I would say we thought the Russian army was 10 feet tall. It was not 10 feet tall. We thought the Ukrainian army was 2 feet tall. It was actually the reverse. The Russian army was very weak. The Ukrainian army had made significant reforms since 2014. A lot of people also thought the Ukrainians couldn't hold out, and how wrong they were. I think most of us were really surprised by how much Europe has changed. Switzerland, Germany, Finland, Sweden, the world is a very different place after Russia's invasion.
Melínda, do you think that the international community made mistakes prior to the war that basically maybe lead to this?
Sure, definitely, many of them. So look, Biden did do a lot of things right. I have to give him credit for the intelligence sharing and for bringing everyone together. That was incredible, and I can't think of another time in history when a leader has done that. So A+ on that effort. But did we do enough to tell Putin that we were serious? No, we didn't. We didn't move enough NATO troops. We didn't convey the consequences. I think if we had done things differently, could this have been avoided? Maybe. We don't know. You know, this is highly speculative. If you go back and look, though, there were a lot of reasons to expect Putin to go in 2022. I predicted it. The U.S. government predicted it. There was a lack of leadership in Europe. Zelensky's polling numbers were going down. Biden's polling numbers were going down. Putin knew he could get away with it. And look, Putin is an opportunist, and he's been wanting to take Ukraine for a long time. So it was only a matter of time, and 2022 was the right year to do it for him.
You're talking about 2022, 2021. How about the decade before? How the international community responded to Putin's action around the neighborhood and in his own country?
So, look, Miroslava, I would say the original sin was back in Bucharest. What the hell were we thinking? An open door with no deadline? Putin just drove a tank right through it. So I think that was one of the original sins when it comes to what the West did wrong.
George, you started, I mean, you know Ukraine very well as well, and you started this work that now become most cited work in all the media around the world, tracking the buildup of Russian military and response of Ukrainian military. Did you foresee that big invasion will happen?
Thank you very much for having me today, Miroslava. You know, I'm going to be completely candid with you. Us at the Institute for the Study of War, we did not assess that the Russians were likely going to invade Ukraine back in late 2021, early 2022. We later revised that assessment in mid-February, but we were one of the last institutes in Washington to come to that conclusion. And the reason why was because we very carefully studied the Russian force deployments around Ukraine, which began in late 2021. We looked at how they were positioned in southwestern Russia and in Belarus, and we studied it, and we said to ourselves, this doesn't look like a competent invasion plan. It doesn't look like the Russians have arrayed themselves with the necessary logistics and command and control, and frankly putting the correct units that would be able to competently achieve their objectives in the right places. And so we assess that this looks more like a pressure campaign, not setting conditions for the actual invasion. Now, even though we got the big picture wrong in terms of the actual assessment, Putin did obviously invade Ukraine, but all of these manifest problems with the Russian campaign, the lack of command and control, the logistics problems, and how it ultimately failed to achieve the decapitation strike against Kiev that Putin sought to achieve within 2 weeks, we were correct in that bottom assessment. So it's been a time of reflection for us, and we're quite pleased that the Russian invasion has not gone well for Mr. Putin.
What is your assessment of Russian and Ukrainian military capability today? There are a lot of tension right now on the battleground on the east. There are a lot of questions about Russia is planning another forceful double invasion. What is your assessment at the today assessment?
We currently forecast that the Russians are preparing for a new decisive effort, likely an offensive operation in eastern Ukraine within the next 6 months. Some timelines could see that new offensive occur as soon as the next 2 or 3 months. And we know that for several reasons. It seems that the Kremlin is actually finally 1 year after facing repeated setbacks and repeated defeats in Kiev, in Kherson, and in Kharkiv. They're now finally taking the serious steps necessary to treat this, frankly, as a serious war. And Putin's doing the things that he should have done before conducting the initial invasion. We see that the Russians are conserving their forces. Of all of the 300,000 mobilized men from September, the Russians have about 150,000 of those still uncommitted. They're saving them for this effort. We also see that the Russians are reorganizing their command and control, but reappointing the top Russian General Gerasimov back to be theater commander, and we see the Russians try to reinvigorate their defense industrial base in order to try to regroup their forces. The Russians are also using Belarus as a massive training ground and using Belarusian trainers and training facilities and that capability to re-equip the very badly degraded and mauled Russian military. We know that the Russian military has also broken its teeth against Ukraine's defenders. There are no more brigades or regiments within the conventional Russian military, combat brigades or regiments, that have not already fought. There are no fresh reinforcements, which is why the Russians, the Kremlin, has had to depend on using the mobilized forces, the convicts from the Wagner Group pulled from prisons, and the waves of mobilization. And now we see the Russians preparing for possibly a second wave of mobilization soon.
Next, we would talk about this military operation, what next and what to expect. I want to ask Ruslan, Ukrainian audience around the world is tuning into Ukrainian service coverage for many years, and it's quite impressive audience we have. You took the helm of Ukrainian service right before the big invasion happened. How do you see the Ukrainian audience behavior changed just before and during this year?
Indeed, there's this big interest from Ukrainian audience to VOA and whatever we have to say. I just want to take a couple of moments to give perspective why it is so. So Ukrainian service was established in 1949. Since that time, Ukrainian service is in Ukraine, reporting in Ukrainian to Ukrainian audience. And throughout the years, we have this unique position that no other media organization, international media organization has in Ukraine, being able to be positioned here in the Washington, D.C., having access to all newsmakers, Congress, White House, Pentagon, being guided by the best in business journalistic standards, and also being able to be in Ukraine, on the ground, having access to all media organizations there. We have almost 50 media partners in Ukraine that we work with. That make us a unique organization that can listen to what West is saying and transmit things to Ukraine in Ukrainian so people could understand, and vice versa. Listen what Ukrainians are thinking and ask questions here. So, having had that, in late 2021, November, December, you were here, we started hearing the reports from US government. The attack is imminent. The Russians are assembling huge force. They're going to invade. We started to broadcast this message to Ukraine.
Nobody wanted to listen.
Nobody wanted to listen. We had huge trust before that. I would say we were the link, the bridge between US and Ukraine. And this was a moment when I thought the bridge is broken, the link is broken. I don't know why. Ukrainians were not ready to listen. They were commenting on our streams. They were telling me, officials or senior officials, why are you saying that? The experts that Washington has know nothing. They are wrong. I don't blame these people. I don't blame Ukrainian officials. They have been living in this reality since 2014. It becomes normal. They compartmentalize this experience. The war was somewhere else. Plus, Russian troops were moving around the border all the time. Ukrainians were not afraid, but also they kind of were sleeping behind the wheel. And then, maybe a week before invasion, when U.S. embassy started to move their personnel from Kiev, when other international organizations started to move out, people started to listen in. We saw a huge spike of interest to our shows on our platforms everywhere. And we started to report. We had 15-minute show daily before. And then we started to report basically every hour on social media news and updates that we had. We saw people were interested to know what West is saying because this was credible. And once this full-scale invasion started, our audience shut up tremendously. And I saw again this link was built. And today, George is talking about the indicators that the next attack is going to come. And I see the same thing is published in Ukrainian media currently. And I see people are listening, people are preparing, people are ready to
accept
the reality and act on that. That's our role.
What are Ukrainian audience in Ukraine and around the world, because we are broadcasting specifically to Ukrainian audience, are most interested in today?
So again, I would start with the week before invasion and the invasion itself. When we were working for Ukrainian audience, our live streams were watched, like we had thousands and thousands of people watching us simultaneously. The biggest question back then was, are we alone? Are we being supported? All political messages, all messages of support, anything that would answer this question was widely thought for, and people were trying to get these answers. Very quickly, maybe 3-4 days, week after that, people were tired of the political rhetoric. People were asking specific questions on our streams. We were reporting to them, and they're saying, okay, we're sitting in the bunkers. Is help coming? Are you going to supply this and that and that? And these questions demanded answers. So our reporters, our journalists, we don't have answers ourselves, but we have access. So we went to the Capitol Hill, we went to the White House, and we were asking these questions. And it was very specific questions that were broadcasted everywhere. And then we will deliver these answers back and report to viewers. And this loop was continuing. So I would say with every month, audience is looking for ways to how Ukraine can win in this war, and what West can do, what US can do, where the leadership is. And this is it's very specific. So every time you go back and start broadcasting very generic answers, political ideas, people don't want to hear that. People want to hear really specifics. Yeah, and I appreciate what George team is doing, and other people are doing, like providing very specific answers to very specific questions.
Thank you. And for the next question, I would like to go to our online audience. Rafael, do we have anything?
Yes, Miroslava, thank you. Still on the lookout for questions. And first of all, thanks to everyone for watching us worldwide. Of course, we have a worldwide audience. And just to remind that we're live on the Inside VOA pages on Facebook and YouTube, as well as Facebook page of the Ukrainian service, Midnight in Kiev right now, but people are watching. And there is for sure interest in the Institute for the Study of War Assessments. So there is question to George on the importance of the commercial satellite imagery for this war. How many approximately commercial satellite companies collaborate with Ukraine and Russia, George?
Thank you for the question. There's been an explosion in the kinds of data that people can collect commercially. There are exquisite data collection capabilities that didn't exist 2 decades ago, that previously only existed within the realm of government agencies and secret classified rooms, but now people can acquire both freely and commercially online, which is fantastic and amazing. It's very instrumental for our work at the Institute for the Study of War. We try to maximize the way that we leverage these new technologies to bring forward honest, timely, accurate assessments to try to help inform the public and inform Western decision makers, as well as help our Ukrainian allies. With regards to how important they are for Ukraine, that goes a little bit beyond my area of expertise. Many of these companies officially claim that they do not support Ukrainian military missions, and I suspect many of their collection capabilities aren't actually precise enough for military applications. But we do know that it's important and that it can actually generate important insights for Ukrainian forces.
Thank you, George. And there is one more question to Melінda on current interactions between different political parties in Ukraine. What is the current policy of the other than Sluga Narodu parties vis-a-vis the ruling party?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
So what is the current policy of the other parties in Ukraine, not the ruling party only, but the other parties?
I mean, for the first time that I can possibly remember, Raphael, Ukrainian politicians have grown up. The political life in Ukraine looks very different. Everyone is getting along, and people aren't backbiting and undermining each other. And I think that this maturity is wonderful, and I hope that it continues long after the war is over.
Yeah, back to you, Miroslava.
My understanding that the listeners or person who was watching was trying to ask, is there plurality in political scene in Ukraine you see today? A little bit more about, yes, they all agree on war. Do they all agree on other issues?
Of course not. And Ukraine is a vibrant Slavic democracy. It's a wild democracy, and that's one of the beautiful parts of Ukraine. I think there have been signs, everyone is focused on winning the war, and there's not a lot of domestic criticism of Volodymyr Zelensky. He's the hero of the world. He's the Churchill of our times. Does that mean that every decision he's making is right? Absolutely not. In particular, I'm worried about press freedom. A lot of people, when you talk to people in Ukraine, are worried that Ukraine will win the war, but it may lose the peace. So that's one issue that I'm watching in particular, Miroslava. How's Ukraine doing on domestic reforms? And I think it deserves greater attention, especially in English.
Ruslan, there are many Ukrainian politicians still coming to DC, and they all come to VOA. What are you hearing from them?
So I would acknowledge one thing that unites everybody here in Ukraine, that being outside the country, talking to international community, Ukraine does sound in one voice. Yeah. Ukraine is united in that regard, and even political opponents, they take this very cautious approach to deliver the message that would benefit Ukraine as a country. I see what Melínda is saying. There is a lot of, still remains a lot of things that this different politicians do not agree on in Ukraine, and they may be not discussing this publicly as much. But I also agree that not every move or step or decision by the government, by Zelensky, is being widely accepted in Ukraine, and there is a lot of opposition, or there is a lot of conversations about that. And I believe Ukrainian government is listening, tuning into that voices that don't think their steps are correct. And the views of tolerance in Ukrainian public is very short currently. Mm-hmm. And when you hear and when they see the corruption examples, when they see something that is not working, I mean, it takes them a spark before they see this, and then they act or voice their opinion. And I can give it to the ruling party in Ukraine currently. They are trying to react on that. They are trying to do some steps to remedy this. Ukraine is not a shining object on the hill. It's not it's not the ideal country by no means. There is a lot of problems, inherent problems in Ukraine that will be solved through many years. But currently, I see a lot of drive, a lot of efforts from people on the ground, from political parties, from civil society to develop rules, develop regulations to benefit Ukraine in the long run.
Are you seeing that current Ukrainian government is actually listening to people, listening to civil society, reacting on the action of the media and civil society?
Well, it's evident that it is. It's evident that the president that came to power on the wave of public interest on the social media campaigns and something that has never been done before is still continuing to relying on this tool, and this is obviously powerful, especially now when everybody in Ukraine, where people are consuming information, how they are sharing the information. People are sitting at homes with their cell phones, scrolling through the social media pages, and you cannot piecemeal this to the public. You cannot contain the information. It's not a public television anymore or private television where you control the message. People see that something is not right is happening. People react to that. I would also say that several things are also happening. First of all, not everybody is blaming or praising the central government, Zelensky and everything. Ukraine become very, it's like US, I would say. People in little towns, they have their governments, they have local mayors, and for local problems,
they trust their local leaders.
For local problems, they go to local leaders or solutions. For big problems, they go to Zelensky and everybody else. And whenever they see big corruption cases, and I command Ukrainian government, they deal with that. So they showed something that they can react for that. So this is very quickly and swiftly, and I think this is resonating.
It's like a fresh air, right?
This is.
Do you want to say something?
I think Ruslan's exactly right. I was in Kiev in September, and in my conversations, there is impatience. You know, we can't afford to live the way that we did before because we've sacrificed too much. I heard that over and over again, all over society. And your point on local mayors is another one. You know, looking back a year, Miroslava, we've seen the growth of mayors across the country. And this is a result, not to get too nerdy, but this is a result of the great decentralization reform and giving that authority to local mayors who are younger. And they cut their teeth with the COVID crisis, and they knew what they were doing. And then when the war started, they showed how determined and capable they were.
Thank you. And I would like to probably tune in to Рафаель and our audience.
Yes, sure. Thank you. And we have one more question in our YouTube channel, and would be good to ask it both, I guess, to George and Melinda. So it says Russia has a large population and is actively mobilizing civilians to send to the front. What can Ukraine do to replenish troops or add new troops to the fight? And the second one is, how is Ukrainian military morale on the ground 1 year after the invasion? So they're almost the similar questions. So please, George.
Sure. When we talk about Russian mobilized forces, we have to take into account that people, bodies, feet and boots is actually only one component of many for effective combat power. Combat power is an abstract concept which refers to many things, both concrete and invisible. People is one and firepower is one, but combat power also has components such as leadership, cohesion, and initiative. And what we've seen in the fighting in Ukraine is that mobilized forces, they don't fight well. They're very bad at defensive operations. They're okay at stiffening lines and defending, but their morale is terrible. And this is really an example of what happens when an enslaved population is forced to go fight a war that people might rhetorically support, but aren't willing to actually die for. Conversely, I would say that Ukrainian morale is fairly high. Ukraine is mobilized. They don't have the same fourth generation problems that the Russians have, and their morale, I think, remains high despite suffering tremendous losses and fighting very, very, very valiantly. I would also say that the Russian military, it's still very dangerous. I want to try to push back against some of the narratives that we've seen after many months of successive Russian military failures. We should not kid ourselves that this is going to be an uphill, easy victory or rather a downhill easy victory for the Ukrainian forces. Ukraine still needs Western supplies and help.
George nailed it. I will only say that your last point should be even more expanded. This is going to be a long, hard fight. Ukrainian soldiers are exhausted, especially around Bakhmut, and we need to make sure that they get the rest and the recuperation that they need. And Miroslava in particular, I'm now working on prosthetics for people who've been lost their limbs, military guys as well as civilians. And I think that's a huge need, and it's a growing need in Ukraine. There's more than 10,000 Ukrainians who have had amputations and need limbs. So that's something that I think the world needs to deliver on as well.
We have a question here, Miroslava. So yes, please, if you can say your name, your title, if you want, and please your question.
Sure. Michael Saukyu, the Executive Vice President of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, which is a representative organization of the Ukrainian American community. I commend Voice of America for doing this particular panel discussion. Voice of America has obviously been, for all of the years, for all of the decades, a stalwart proponent of that information that is necessary for parts of the world. In particular, if you think about it being formed Soviet Union times for all of that information to get to subjugated Ukraine. We've heard from the three panelists about Ukraine needs to win this war. I think we all understand that Ukraine needs to win this war. But frankly speaking, I think what's missing here is a component of, to win a war, you have to define who the enemy is. And I think we see Ukraine has a kinetic war that's going on. There's a political war that's going on in terms of the propaganda, in terms of obviously everything that's emanating from Moscow. There's an economic war that's happening, as well as a cyber war, as well as a propaganda war. How do we fit all of these components into assessing the capabilities of Ukraine to make sure that Ukraine literally does win this war?
It's a called hybrid war. Do you have any answer to this?
I knew he was going to ask a good question. So look, we have to be smart. And we have to have a long-term plan. There's a lot of pieces to the question that Michael asked, but look, getting the Ukrainians the military assistance they need now, before the spring offensive sets in, is absolutely key. We can't sit on our hands. The United States is the leader, and Europe will follow. So let's not have any more hand-wringing discussions about F-16s. Let's do it. Let's do it now. Let's get this over as soon as possible. Michael McFaul just wrote a great piece in Foreign Affairs, and he says, look, if we want to end this, we have to send the equipment right now. He calls it the Big Bang Theory. And the sooner we get them the equipment they need, the sooner this is over. Michael, I'm really concerned about economic support. This is the unsexy budget support that keeps Ukraine alive. So last year, the United States gave $9 billion with a B. And this provides for roads and schools, and it pays for pensions. And without that money, Ukraine becomes Afghanistan. So we have to make sure that Ukraine gets that money, and also be talking to Republicans and explaining, look, I know you would prefer to go pave a road in Alaska, but we have to pay pensions in Ukraine for a short period of time to win the war. So those are the biggies, and then making sure that Ukraine gets the humanitarian support it needs. And I would also call on Washington to wake up and get serious about reconstruction. I can't find anyone in Washington, in the U.S. government, who wants to talk about reconstruction. The attitude is, we're going to win the war and Europe's going to rebuild Ukraine. It doesn't work that way. We are the leader of the free world. Let's act like it.
I'd like to jump on to
okay, yes.
Melinda's excellent response, if I may. We need to get serious about supporting Ukraine militarily. All the different lines of effort that you articulated are very important, but they all support the military and political objective of capturing all of Ukraine. And Putin's objective, even though his means to achieve that have not changed, we have been keeping Ukraine on a starvation diet for the aid that it needs. We sent Ukraine HIMARS back in June, which later eventually resulted with the Ukrainians being able to liberate Kherson many months later in November. There was no reason for us to send the HIMARS as late as we did, because there were necessary shaping operations and certain time sequences in time and in space and these delays resulted with more Ukrainians dying, the Ukrainians not being able to get their counteroffensives going off the ground. And the key limiting factor was the slow rate at which we've been providing Ukraine aid. We finally now decided to give Ukraine the main battle tanks, part of them, of what they've been asking for months, even though we have likely identified the need for such weapons, many, many months ago. We're now debating about sending them the aircraft. We frankly need to stop this game of pony show and ask ourselves, if our objectives are to ensure that Ukraine wins this war and survives as a state, then we need to take all the steps that are necessary for that now.
Yes, we have one more question. Yes, please, here.
Thank you very much. My name is Mikola Mirsky. I'm the Director for Government Affairs at Razom for Ukraine. My question goes to Putin's intent. We've touched on it. We've had a question that touches on it. I think it's important for us to understand better what are the roles of civil society and news organizations in understanding and disseminating information about what Putin wants to do. That we've seen a lot of dehumanizing rhetoric, genocidal rhetoric coming from the Kremlin and from those that are close to it. We've also seen a lot of indicators that they want to recreate Russian Empire 2.0 in some form. What do you see as the role of news organizations and civil society in sharing that kind of information?
Ruslan, probably you will start and then...
Well, I would start with the point that I don't think anybody can answer the question, what does Putin want? If he wanted Ukraine in Russia, he would not bomb and destroy all the industrial sites, or he would do something else, because how would you rebuild all this destruction? It looks like the purpose is destruction, but what is behind that? So we don't know. We are tuned to that to messages that coming from Russia, from various outlets. We are listening to that. We're looking at that, and I would say they probably don't know either. So sometimes they conflict with each other every day on different matters, and frankly, to a lot of extent, a lot of journalists, experts, they basically stopped listening to what Russia is saying. They were looking what Russia is doing. Yeah. We are seeing what Russia is, what forces are going where the political affiliations are made. So some clues, what is Russian intent. Some of the theories that are being discussed, and the expert that talked to us saying is that Russia cannot win this war for world dominance or world power, cannot compete with world powers. Russia cannot compete with China or US or Europe, not militarily as we saw it, economically, culturally. They don't produce anything, they're just lagging, but they want to. So what do you do? And this is one of the strategies, probably try to divide this unity in the world, create this artificial spheres of influence, allow different big players control the spheres, and that's how you grow up. But that what we see currently over the last year, they have not been able to defeat this unity in the world. The NATO is still strong. EU, which was, I mean, you cannot agree on anything in EU, but they are working together. Different governments are working together. There is a lot of things that Russia was not able to do. So I think the first plan that Putin might have had, because I don't know what was the plan, failed. So now it's a question what they are trying to do with Ukraine, because currently they basically try to destroy it, to defeat it, to subject just territory to Ukraine.
I know that we have some more questions, right?
Yes, thank you very much, Miroslava. We have a question from YouTube of Ukrainian service. Hanna Usov asks, does America already have a vision of rebuilding of Ukraine after its victory? So maybe Melinda?
Not that I can tell, honestly, and I'm not trying to be cute here, but the U.S., to its credit, is focused on winning the war. And I think that's right, but we are America, and we could do more than one thing at the same time. So one other thing the Biden administration has not done well, the Biden administration gets a pretty good grade if I were to evaluate how it's prepared and responded. I'd probably give it a flat B. But it has not explained to the American public why this conflict matters and why they should sacrifice. And I think that President Biden should do that on February 24th. He should explain to Americans why this country 5,000 miles away matters to them.
Thank you. And it's actually good path to one more question about what is at stake in this war. Why, you said, Biden should explain why this war is important to understand and do something about it.
So nothing short of the global order. And I know that's a jargony term, but the world is completely different because of what Putin did. What happens 5,000 miles away matters to people in Alabama. It matters to people in Alaska. It matters to all of us. And it matters because if Putin can get away with it, then other reckless dictators will do the same thing. It will be copied. It will threaten the global order, but it matters morally. And Americans cannot turn a blind eye, especially after the Holocaust. We have this slogan of never again. Do we believe it? I think many Americans do.
What is at stake?
I think Melinda said it very, very well. We don't want to revert back to the 17th century where great powers can butcher their neighbors and take with a pen and redraw the borders of their surroundings. I know a lot of people in my realm of work are concerned about China and Taiwan. And I think it's very clear that Xi is watching very closely the events that are unrolling in Ukraine. And Ukraine is actually, for the West and the United States, it's a much easier case to prove that we will stand up against aggression, wars of conquest against bullies in Ukraine than in Taiwan. Another point that I'll also highlight is that I think I will make the case that the Russians are engaged in genocidal activity within Ukraine. We know that the Russians, Russian officials, they broadcast this very clearly. They are taking children from occupied eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine and sending them to Russia for forced readoptions, which is a violation on the Convention of Genocide. So like Melinda said, if we're going to tell ourselves never again, well, this is that moment where we need to stand up against that tyranny.
Absolutely.
Just want to go back a little bit to Ukraine, and as a journalist, you listen what people are thinking, are saying there, what they want, and for Ukrainians at stake, it's obviously it's an existence of the country, but it's always amazes me how we can debate here, be not sure about things, have different variations. In Ukraine, for some reason, I hear a lot of clarity. I mean, people, it's a birth of the nation. People woke up. People now starting to understand why they want to live in the democracy, in this sovereign country, why they want to have democratic principles, why they value liberties, and they are ready to defend this, and they are voicing this very, very loudly and clearly. And this is a process. When I was just come back a little bit. When I was in the 90s, when I was a student of political science and a young reporter, I would talk to much older folks who fought for Ukrainian independence during the Soviet time, and they were kind of even sad sometimes that independence was given to Ukraine. It was not fought over. It was not, there was not any war, and they were genuinely worried that this will come later, and this is what we see coming now. So people, today Ukraine is fighting for its independence, and things that you are fighting for, you start to appreciate. And what we see currently, what people appreciate, freedoms, democracy. People want to have this. And the war is not won yet. So I mean, we are talking how to rebuild Ukraine. I mean, you see our audience is already far ahead of us. But the war is still going on. There is a real clear threat that, and the West should definitely be on the forefront of that. But for Ukrainian people, for Ukrainian nation, this is the beginning of the country that will be this shining object on the hill with the great democratic values. That's my belief.
You will have the chance to add to that. I actually think maybe our audience have something to say maybe to this particular question.
Yes, so what's at stake? I saw one hand here, and please, if you can maybe answer this question first. What's at stake? What do you think in this war? And then your question to our panelists.
Thanks. Eric Hansen with the Center for International Private Enterprise. And I have to agree with Melynda here that it is at stake. I've had the opportunity to travel to Asia and in Seoul and other areas. It's all that's on people's mind. And so our world order, the international rules-based order, is what's at stake here. And if we want to continue growth and wealth creation, then we have to fight for Ukraine. It is in our interests. My question to the panel would be that since independence in 1991, Ukraine has essentially fought two enemies. One, an external enemy through the Russian Federation, its purchase and its through Kremlin proxies of strategic Ukrainian assets. And the other is the internal fight against corruption. So since the war started, either in 2014 or in 2022, take your choice of dates, what specifically has Ukraine undertaken to root out both the external enemy of corruption and the internal enemy of corruption?
Thank you.
Eric, I think you know the answer to that question better than we do. So after 2014, Ukraine built a number of anti-corruption institutions, and we can get into the details. Not all of them have borne fruit, but I think that the fight is on and it's serious, and civil society is highly active and is not afraid to blow whistles and make noise. So on the anti-corruption fight, there's actually quite a bit of progress that's not getting enough attention, even in spite of the war. And I am confident and hopeful in the long term that Ukraine is not only going to be victorious over Russia, but it's going to take care of its corruption problem once and for all. I think that Kiev is going to be the new Berlin when our kids are in college, and people are going to want to go to Kiev and have their sort of early 20s there. It's such a cool city, and the world has yet to discover that.
I think one of the key things that the Ukrainians have done, especially since 2014, is rooting out the corruption that exists within the military culture within Ukraine. Ukraine, like all other former states occupied by the Soviet Union, it had a military culture that was built around centralized command and control, dictated from the top down through party leadership and very rigid military bureaucracy. That's not how effective armies fight. And Ukraine has done very well for itself in instilling within itself a new core of officers, reorienting themselves around taking initiative, so that when your commanding officer in the field is killed, your subordinates don't just stand around and wait for new orders. That's what Russian soldiers do in Ukraine, and that's part of why they're not very effective. But they know they're going to shoot back. They know what their intent is for their commander. They know what they can do, and they've done very well. And it's actually one of the key unseen reforms that has actually impacted and been a force multiplier for why outgunned and outnumbered Ukrainian forces have been so effective on the battlefield.
Ruslan, do you support that?
Well, corruption exists everywhere, right? The question is how do you deal with that? So you have to have systems, first of all, that would help to deal with that, and this is where the West role is, pretty much to push for that, to push for establishment of all these courts and all these institutions that would handle that. But also it's a level of tolerance of the society, plus I would say the level of freedom of media. And I see a lot, if something becomes public, it's a big deal. And in Ukraine currently, despite everything, despite whatever is happening, people, media organizations are covering corruption, looking into this. And some tools were established before the war, like Prozoro system, the way you can check whatever is being bought by the government. Different things were established before, and these tools are still being used. And I just listened recently to Ukrainska Pravda special about their investigation about this recent wave of corruption in Ukraine. And reporters were genuinely surprised how different it felt for them, the reaction from the government. Because before that, they would report on that. They would make it public sometimes, but it was it would go away, and everybody would tune into something else. Now there is a reaction. So what do we have now? We have some tools in place. We have people being able to voice concerns about this, and we have reaction from the government on different levels dealing with that. And this is the way how you deal with corruption. That's it.
All of you said that this war is not far from over yet, right? And but there are a lot of discussion, specifically in the West, about how this war supposed to end? What is the way to end this war? There are a lot of talks about possible peace plan, negotiation with Putin, and so on. I want you to address those questions and tell me, how do you see this war ending?
I think there's a lot of bad talk and bad reporting right now about how most wars end in some form of negotiation, and therefore, so will this war. But if you are a historian of war, like my colleagues are, and if you look at most wars actually don't end in negotiation. Yes, there might be some diplomatic treaty that is signed to formally define the end state of the war, but most negotiations are actually seated and written in the reality of the battlefield. And therefore, we must ensure that the Ukrainians are able to dictate negotiations on terms preferable to them, which are rooted in battlefield realities. And in order for that to happen, the Ukrainians need to regain control over all of Ukraine's de jure internationally recognized borders, including Donbass, including Crimea, as the Russian Federation and multiple legal documents already codified and agreed is Ukrainian territory.
Melynda, is there openness for peace talk?
No, there's not. So Zelensky has ruled it out, and rightfully so, especially after Bucha, after the war crimes have been discovered. And when you talk to Ukrainians, there's no way. And George is exactly right. Ukrainians have to take back as much territory as possible in order to get the best deal at the negotiating table. There will be some kind of deal at some point. But look, there's at least 3 different scenarios. One is Russia wins and it is able to take the territory it seized. I think that's very unlikely, but it depends on the West. It depends on what we do with our financial support and the weapons we send. One option is Ukraine wins and it's able to retake the territory which George described. And when you talk to military experts like Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, he says it's eminently doable, but again, it depends on us. The most likely scenario and the worst case scenario is a ceasefire, and there's a freezing of the borders, and Russia is able to take a break, take a breather, and train up a whole new group of boys, and then they come back at Ukraine again. And that's what we want to avoid. And that's why Michael McFaul and many other people are saying, do it now, give the Ukrainians all the weapons they need, let's get this over with.
Ruslan, what do you hear from Ukrainians?
As a journalist, I would say that Ukrainians are very, most of them, voices that we hear, are very, very categorical. They want to win, and they want to get back the territory, and they want to have Ukrainian government present on the whole part of territory. They want to have their freedoms. I have no idea how this can be achieved. I think in the long run it should be done like that. Ukraine deserves to have the country, it deserves to be independent, and with that will and determination it will happen. But what is how long it can take, I have no idea. And what I see now, Ukrainians it's very difficult for them. It's very difficult for military, it's very difficult for people, even in the western part of Ukraine. No power, no heat, no nothing, and money is running out. Yeah. But the resolve is there. They can, when I call home, my parents, they can complain for 30 seconds, and then they say that no, it's not going to happen. We're going to win, and everything is going to be all right. They're more optimistic than I am, so I'm drawing energy from them. Yeah.
I know we have more questions.
Yes, more questions, and very important questions. George has already mentioned that Ukrainian kids were kidnapped, even taken hostages to Russia. And there is a question, how many Ukrainian children do you estimate have been taken to Russia to be adopted by Russian families, and what can be done to bring them home, which is more simple?
I'd have to double check what the Ukrainian authorities have stated, but it's well over in the multiple thousands. I don't know what the exact number is. And the crazy thing about it is that Russian government officials, this is not a secret, they don't deny it. They openly advertise these programs, so they're very quite shameless about it.
Thank you. And one more question to Melynda. How important is the information war? What steps are Ukrainian government taking to try to reach the Russian population and convince them to oppose the war?
That's an interesting question. I don't know, but I hope that they are messaging. You know, I'm encouraged to see more real independent Russian media, and it's outside of Russia in particular. There's some amazing journalism going on from Prague, and I think that that's the kind of journalism that's going to change people's hearts. It's independent Russian journalists who've left Russia after the war and set up their own stations, and they're getting millions and millions of views. Raphael, I think there is an appetite within Russia for real information, and I think we're finally starting to see that.
And it seems we can add that President Zelensky records some messages in Russian as well. Yes?
Absolutely.
And also a question for Ruslan, if we may,
Yes,
if we may take one more question. So Ruslan, given your role reaching audiences, it's asking about VOA in whole, not only in country but also in diaspora. How does the refugee impact of Ukraine inform your efforts?
Well, we consider people, recent refugees, as part of our audience, because we have a lot of people tuning into our shows, to our programs, that are interested in what we have to say, because this is alternative voice to what Ukrainian media are saying, and plus this is in Ukrainian. A lot of people don't necessarily consume information in English or other languages, so this audience is growing. It's very active, and again, my anecdotal perspective, they ask the most questions on our chat. They want to know exactly what Ukraine is, what West is doing or supplying or is going to do for Ukraine to win, because they want to go back and again get back to the community. That's the feedback that we are getting from Ukrainian audience.
And we will be kind of wrapping up this discussion. However, I think it's a very important questions today. Let's, if you all believe Ukraine will win, what kind of obstacles do you see today for Ukraine to succeed after, in rebuilding Ukraine and after the war is over? And how do you envision Ukraine after the war is over?
I think Ukraine will have a lot to offer the West in terms of its experiences in fighting the conventional Russian military and largely defeating the conventional Russian military. Listen, Russia's military is going to have to be rebuilt after this war concludes. We know that the Russians seek to build a large conventional military that they hope will not only win in Ukraine, but also be able to achieve their larger aspirations against Europe and NATO. Just recently, Russian Foreign Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu announced that Russia wants to build 12 new maneuver divisions. That is a significant force, and they plan to do this not in the short term, but over the span of many years. Ukraine, I see becoming a bastion, a defender of Europe. It'll be the frontline border, protecting the West and protecting Europe and our NATO allies. Ukraine also has a tremendous amount of actual practical combat experience fighting the conventional Russian threat, fighting modern conventional combined arms warfare. I think that our military service academies, they have a tremendous amount to learn from from studying Ukrainian operations, Ukrainian operational art, Ukrainian tactics, and seeing how they've used our systems, javelins, HIMARS, Stingers, on the battlefield to great effect. And I see the Ukrainians being able to give us a lot of utility in the defense sector.
Linda.
So I see at least three big challenges. The first is time, and this is the most significant of the challenges. Time is on Moscow's side. It is not on Kiev's side. So the sooner we can end this, the better. There's a lot of things involved with time, but as a conflict goes on longer and longer, it's going to be difficult to keep the coalition together in Europe. Political leadership is going to change in America. We don't know which way it's going to change. I can criticize the Biden administration, but the bottom line is that this is an experienced team. They know everyone. They know how to build coalitions in Europe. They know how to lead. And it may not always be so. They may not always be in power. So time is really a big challenge. The second is fatigue, that these numbers, look, there's going to be other crises in the world. And you can't always keep everyone focused on Ukraine. And if you study Ukraine since 2014 on, from 2014 until the war started in February, there was still a war, but you know the world didn't really pay much attention to it. So keeping the world's eye on the ball is going to be difficult. Now the future, this is where I get to end on an optimistic note. I'm extremely optimistic about the future of Ukraine. I've spent the last 15 years going back and forth, and Ukraine is not what you think it is. Ukraine is modern, it's creative, and it's going to be the coolest country in Europe once it rebuilds. Its creative people in their 30s and 40s are stunning in technology, in fashion, in cooking. It goes on and on and on, and it's cheap. So I think that once the war is over, I think there's going to be a creative class in Europe is going to want to be part of this vision. And there's an experimentation that you don't see in stodgy old Europe. Ukrainians don't like bureaucracy. They're really impatient. So I'm excited about the future of Ukraine. We just got to win the war.
They're very similar to Americans who love freedom and don't want government to get to their business.
Miroslava, and I see Ukraine as a member of NATO for a lot of the reasons that George articulated, but Ukraine has a security dilemma, and the West has not solved that dilemma. And I think Ukraine has proven that it is a capable military ally, so that's going to happen.
Ruslan.
Yeah, I see a lot of examples how Ukraine is similar to US, actually, and we see a lot of interest to US events and way of life from Ukrainians. Again, Ukrainians love freedoms. Ukrainians love to be masters on their territories. They want to be governed by their local mayors. They don't like big tsars ruling over them. This is American way of life, and we see a lot of interest in stories that show how Americans live. Second, the biggest problem that is happening in Ukraine can turn to be the biggest plus for Ukraine. All this 8 million people that left Ukraine, many of them, it's a young, active women with children, with careers ahead of them. Many of them want to go back. It's very difficult to leave outside the country, be immigrant. It's not a easy bread. Some will stay, but many will come back to Ukraine after the war. They will bring the best experience that they got. They will not go back to the old ways, and I'm sure in that, I'm confident in that. And for our work, we will be working really hard to show how America is functioning, good and bad, different things, for Ukrainians to choose what they want to do, have an example, and we'll be watching how Ukrainians are bringing their best experiences back to Ukraine to build Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, our audience. Thank you to all our guests in the studio and online, as well as our panelists for this fruitful discussion. I want to conclude this special show devoted to the Russian war in Ukraine with a quote from Yale historian Timothy Snyder. In his recent article in Foreign Affairs titled "Ukraine Holds the Future," he pointed out, quote, "Russia, an aging tyranny, seeks to destroy Ukraine, a defined democracy. A Ukrainian victory would confirm the principle of self-rule, allow the international integration of Europe to proceed, and empower people of goodwill to return reinvigorated to other global challenges. A Russian victory, by contrast, would extend genocidal policies in Ukraine, subordinate Europeans, and render any vision of geopolitical European Union obsolete." Yale historian Timothy Snyder. Thank you for joining us. Listen and stay with VOA.